Hello again. I told you earlier that I was going to talk with you after the video. I think there are a number of issues that are worth discussing. But first, I should say that the board investigation process is very complicated. And it is not the same in every state. Some states are worse. Some states are much better than what you have seen here. But I think what you have seen is a good representation. So, here are the issues that I think may be worth discussing. First, how important is due process? Remember, due process is a number of things. It is the right to know exactly what you are accused of doing. To have a clear standard, rule or law by which one can understand what you may have done wrong. To review all the evidence. You have a right to face your accuser and to ask questions. It means that you are innocent until proven guilty. It also means that you have a right to a fair hearing or trial before an impartial judge or jury of peers. And you have the right to examine and cross-examine witnesses. And there are rules for the admission of evidence and questioning people. You have a right to appeal a decision to a higher independent authority that is fair and impartial. And you also have the right to not incriminate yourself if you are accused of committing a crime. Or, at least you have a right to understand the questions so that you can characterize your response fully. Most psychology boards tend to argue that due process is too expensive and time-consuming. That is not so. Sure, a full-on trial is expensive and time-consuming. But due process is not expensive. The cost of a flawed process is more expensive. It may require a board to do a more thorough job. And you should know that the boards that license attorneys generally follow due process. They get to see the evidence and ask questions. Does a psychologist need to know exactly what they are accused of doing? Does a psychologist need to know the evidence that will be used to judge them? Should the psychologist have the right to face their accuser and ask questions? Should a psychologist have the right to present a defense, based on the evidence, before he or she is found guilty? Why would you require a psychologist to defend their actions, when they don't know the evidence and what they are accused of doing? Should a psychologist be found guilty when there was no clear standard to follow and the harm to a patient or another person was not significant? How do you feel about being judged in situations where the ethical principles and code of conduct conflict, and there is no absolute right thing to do? What should happen when a psychologist acted on the basis of one ethical principle but the board felt they should have acted on the basis of another? When is your responsibility to your patient greater than your responsibility to other people? Should a psychologist always remain neutral and refrain from taking actions to protect their patient from abuse or influences that could cause significant harm? Does a psychologist have a greater responsibility to their patient than to others when the risk of harm to others is minimal compared to the risk of harm to their patient? If a psychologist feels they must take some action on behalf of their patient, and with the patient's permission, can the psychologist risk minimal harm to others in order to protect their patient from significant harm? If a psychologist witnessed someone who was physically aggressive with your patient, can the psychologist take steps to stop that person? For example, if your patient is breaking down, and you had your patient's permission, should you take steps on their behalf to protect or insulate them from destabilizing influences? In other words, can you talk to others and ask that certain people refrain or not be allowed to interact with your patient? Should a psychologist use their credibility and influence to protect their patient from abuse and stress that would be harmful to their patient? What if you are in a situation where you would like to consult, but there was no one to consult with? I mean, is it enough that you tried to do the ethical thing? What is your idea of unprofessional behavior? Which do you think is worse? Standing by and doing nothing, because you are afraid you will get in trouble, but you are not sure what for? Or, should you risk making a mistake by doing something that you believe is the ethical and professional thing to do for your patient? I have to say that it may be easier for some people to do nothing and say you did not know what to do, than it is to hold the benefit of other people above your own. What do you do in a situation for which there is no written standard, no law and no case examples that illustrates what principle you should follow or the standard of care would be? What do you think about other professions that have less restrictive boards? Are patients and the public really injured by less restrictive standards? In the justice system, there are two legal standards upon which people are judged. The first is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The second is guilty based on a preponderance of evidence. People accused of wrongdoing in the criminal justice system are judged innocent if there is reasonable doubt. In civil court, a person is usually judged guilty based on a preponderance of evidence. Psychology boards have no clear or accountable standard by which they judge psychologists. Should the psychologist be required to prove they are not guilty to a board that now has to admit they were wrong? Is it realistic to believe that a board that was not fair to begin with will be fair and admit their process is flawed and their decision was wrong? If the board's process was essentially a mistrial, should the psychologist be given a new hearing? I mean, should a guilty decision that is based on a flawed and unfair process still stand? Or should the decision be thrown out and the process start over from scratch? Why does the psychologist have to prove they are innocent to people who do not recognize and still support a flawed decision? And I think this question is important. Should the board's decision be published to the entire professional community and the world, using the internet before the psychologist even knows what they allegedly did wrong and the evidence upon which they were judged? In the justice system, no one can be found guilty of anything based on evidence that they did not know about. Think about it. Can you imagine being in a trial where you are asked to leave the courtroom and the judge and jury are presented evidence that you don't get to see or hear? Is it fair to give a psychologist the right to appeal a board's decision and yet the board can ignore the judge's decision? What do you think about the manner in which a board can interview a psychologist? Is it fair that a board can ask questions for 20 minutes and a psychologist is given much less time? Is that enough time to begin with? Should a psychologist be allowed to ask questions when they are interviewed by a board and a board investigator? How do you think it feels to be a psychologist who was found guilty, and then you find out that the allegations and evidence used against you were wrong, false or misleading? These questions really make me stop and think. I think about them a lot. And this may surprise you. Your career and life can be ruined if you are found guilty of an ethical violation. In many cases, you will no longer be able to participate in Medicare, insurances panels, managed care or work as an expert witness. Your peers will also talk about you. Your reputation and career can be ruined. And even if the board changes their mind, your career is still ruined. Negative rumors of guilt spread farther and faster than good news that you are exonerated in the appeal. And I guess some of the most important questions might be these. Does a board of psychology need to operate in the manner that they do? Or is there a better way? I mean, why would a board that licenses attorneys follow due process and a psychology board would not? So, I hope you will discuss these issues in your training and with your peers and professors. And I have one last question. If you think your state psychology board is not acting ethically or professionally, why does the profession of psychology allow this to happen? I hope you found this video interesting, and I hope it makes you think. Thank you.